It's so exciting to be with you all this morning. It's a privilege to be with such a large group of Jesus followers who are spending a weekend thinking about discipleship. So thank you very much for having me. Before I go any further with this talk about worship, whole of life, I should perhaps admit that I've never been an elder. However, I've had 24 years experience of working with elders. Now, I know what you're going to say. He doesn't look old enough to have been a minister for 24 years. And thank you for that. But I've had these years of experience of working with elders in two amazing kirk sessions in Ferrantosh near Dingwall and Lenzie Union near Glasgow. And the other admission is that while I have a passion for worship, I'm not in any way an expert in worship, and there's a lot more that a lot of other people could say about worship, whole of life, and there will be a lot of gaps in what I say. But for the last 4 years, I've been the vice convener of the Mission and Discipleship Council with responsibility for the area of worship. I finish in a few weeks at the Assembly, and after this talk, you'll probably be thinking, well, about time too. Anyway, we have just about an hour now to think together about worship, whole of life. And I'm aware of all the insights that you bring to this, and we'll have time and space to reflect and to allow folk time to discuss during this time together. But to try to be relevant and practical, I'm going to keep an eye on two things throughout what I'll say. One is trying to relate worship, the whole of life, to the theme of this conference about discipleship and the journey of discipleship. And the second one is trying to relate worship, the whole of life, to the job of being an elder in a kirk session and in a congregation. And I'm going to split it up into three parts. You can tell I've been doing sermons for a very long time now, but three parts. And the first part is longer than the others. So if you think after the first part, good grief, we've got an awful lot winged, don't worry. The first part is longer than the others. What I'm going to talk about to begin with is making connections between worship and the whole of life, continuing to make connections between worship and the whole of life. The second section will be about developing a culture of expectancy in worship, particularly worship on Sundays. And thirdly, focusing on three areas where worship may be woven into the whole of life. And then I'll end with one, hopefully, practical suggestion. So, let's take a moment to set the scene, thinking about making connections between worship and the whole of life. Now, a church notice board. You see that? 8 o'clock, communion, 9:15, Holy Communion with a robed choir, 10:45, Holy Communion, contemporary with music group, and 6:30, choral evensong, traditional with the robed choir. That's some church notice board, isn't it? And it's big, and it's clear, and it's about worship. And as elders, we probably know all about notice boards like this. We go to kirk session meetings for fun, and we see, say, in item number 4 on the agenda, communication team report, subsection F, church notice board. And maybe we've argued about the colour and the size of notice boards. Maybe we've queried the cost of notice boards. And we've admired it when it was new, and then wondered why our new notice board hasn't brought in the crowds. But this is a notice board about worship, or to be specific, worship times. Now, worship, so we're told, is the sole prerogative of the minister, more's the pity. We know that. But setting the times of worship, that's the responsibility of the kirk session, and we know that. And what a choice in this notice board, deliberately chosen from outside Scotland to avoid causing any offence. And it looks like there it's robed choir 2, contemporary music 1, and if you don't like music at all, then it's an early kick-off for you at 8 o'clock with the said communion. So, that's worship. We know about that. We know when worship happens. We know how long worship lasts. And perhaps most importantly, we know when worship is due to finish. Worship. Now, the other part of the title I was given, the whole of life, we know about that as well, for we're living it, and in some way we're experts at it. The family ties and responsibilities and regrets, the whole of life, the work we're paid to do and the work we don't get paid to do, the whole of life. The worries, the holidays, the global issues, the tiny details of individual lives, we know about the whole of life. And we're trying to live the whole of life as Jesus' disciples in the strength of the Spirit. This, I hope, links us back to the theme of the conference and journey of discipleship. Fishers on Lake Galilee. We're trying to be like them, aren't we? The first disciples. We're on this journey of discipleship. We're trying to learn from Jesus how to fish, trying to give him our boats, our nets, our lives. We're trying to be disciples throughout the whole of life. And we talk about the whole of life as elders. Maybe we have an elders district, and the whole of life comes up in conversation when we visit people in our district. And bits of the whole of life come up on our session agendas, pastoral care, events happening in the community, discussing ways in which we can help with the needs of the community that the church is serving. We know about the whole of life, but it comes under a separate item in the Kirk session agenda from worship, doesn't it? Worship and the whole of life. But are they so separate? The first picture and the second. All that was going on in Lake Galilee with those first disciples, the following, the leaving the boats and the nets, is it not summed up in the words of worship? If you were at the traditional service, it might be, take my life and let it be, consecrated Lord to thee, Almighty Father of all things that be, our life, our work, we consecrate to thee. Worship and the whole of life, they're not so separate. And if we were at the contemporary service, I will offer up my life in spirit and truth. Here I am, Lord. Is it I, Lord? I have heard you calling in the night. I will go, Lord, if you lead me. I will hold your people in my heart. Worship and the whole of life, they're not that separate, are they? We thought with that notice board of worship, different styles of worship, worship that reflects and uses words to express, to pray about the whole of life. I'm going to suggest that we take a pause just for a moment and think. I've suggested 4 hymns. Think what hymn or worship song speaks to you about your life just now. Is there something that you've sung or is going round your head just now that speaks of what's going through your life just now? Take a moment to think about that, a hymn, worship song that speaks to your life just now. And if you want to, just for a couple of minutes, talk to the person beside you or behind you and share what's speaking to you just now. So we'll take just 2 or 3 moments to do that just now. A hymn or worship song that speaks of the whole of your life. Okay, that was good to hear a buzz of folks sharing these different things. Worship gives us words to say to God about the whole of life. Connections already being made between the two. The nets, the boat, the stuff of the whole of life, they're part of worship. And the whole of life is part of worship in our journey of discipleship. But would a passerby, this clear and well-meaning notice board, would a passerby know that from what's said there, that the whole of their life can be bound up in worship, and worship is relevant to the whole of life? So when we're thinking about making connections between worship and whole of life, just going to start with the obvious, the welcome and the signs that we're giving off. Because I wonder, thinking about it, if somebody pitching up looking at that and has come at the wrong time, you know that classic film, Monsters, Inc.? You can tell that our kids were little in the early 2000s. Anyway, the heroes arrive at this office and there's a help desk. And just as they arrive at the help desk, the woman behind it pulls down the shutter and says with huge satisfaction, "This office is now shut." If you arrived at 1:45 outside any of our churches, would it say, "This office, worship, is now shut"? So when we think about making connections, worship in the whole of life, there's welcome and the signs and signals that we give off. How welcoming are we? I know that I can, by my words or actions, put people off. We all can. I'm going to tell one negative story, and this is it really. When our children were still preschool age, we went on holiday. And we saw a church notice advertising for worship on the parish church on the Sunday. And we decided that the 9:30 a.m. all-age family service would be a good plan for us. So we rushed down at 9:29 a.m. with what must have seemed the whole of life. Buggy, rucksack containing books and colouring books and snacks, and our son probably had the ubiquitous plastic Buzz Lightyear in his hands. Reach for the stars. The door was shut. We rattled it. Someone opened it. No family service today. Oh, when is the service this week? 11 a.m. and it's communion. In a tone that, I'm afraid, conveyed that it would really be far better for all concerned if we didn't come back at 11 a.m. Anyway, the Baptist church down the road made us all very welcome. But, you know, the obvious thing about worship and the whole of life, when people come with the whole of life, the stuff, and they don't fit in necessarily to what we've planned and our schedules, does it sometimes seem that the office is now shut? Because it's not. Worship is for the whole of life. Pause for a moment and just think about your own place, where you worship, where you serve. What one thing would make people feel more welcome to worship in our church? Okay? what one thing would make people feel more welcome to worship in our church? So think about that, and then maybe you might want to discuss it with people around you. Just take a few minutes to do that. What one thing would make people more welcome to worship in our church? Okay. Well, that sounds as though that's a lot of problems ironed out and solutions found. There's only a little bit of time for discussion, obviously, just now, but some of the seminars and the workshops later on in the day will explore some of these questions and themes. And there's opportunities for conversation at meal times too. But worship and whole of life, making the connections between the two, they are linked. And talking about worship, that's one way together that we make the links. This is a shameless plug, really. Mission and Discipleship have produced this resource called Conversations in Worship. It's really 4 or 5 very kind of simple questions that lead out discussion that congregations or Kirk sessions or any group can really use. And there is a seminar on that this afternoon, and I think anybody who uses it, I hope, would find it helpful. But I was involved in doing some of the pilots for this. And I remember one memorable evening that my colleague and I spent in the north of Skye, asking, one of the questions was, where have you encountered God in worship? And so often, none of the answers have been in church on a Sunday morning. But the one that affected me very much was when a crofter said, on a spring morning, with the sun coming up and a lamb being born, the whole of life and worship. And I was able to praise God for that. So, shameless plug, resource available. You can get it on the Church of Scotland website, click under worship, and then you'll see Conversations in Worship there. Worship and the whole of life. Making connections. Making people welcome. Bringing the whole of their life there. Making space for the nets and the boats and the stuff of the whole of life and the journey of discipleship in our worship. But of course, worship is open all of the time. Access to God is never shut. Parables like the persistent widow show us that, and the psalmist says that God neither slumbers nor sleeps. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm suggesting that we go back and organise a rota to keep the church building open at all times. That worship, whole of life, means the church open 24/7. But I wonder, are there ways in which in our churches, that we as elders can foster a sense that worship naturally continues through the days of the week? This is nothing new. Many of us have been nurtured by the practice of a daily quiet time. Time in the day to read the Bible, to pray, to bring the whole of life to God in prayer and praise every day. Some denominations have age-old patterns of morning and evening prayer every day. As I said in the worship, Mission and Discipleship publishes Pray Now with morning and evening prayers which touch on the things of the whole of life. And there are lots more. As elders, are there ways in which we can share this? Do you know what I mean? To foster this sense that worship is for the whole of life. And that just might be slipping something in that we found helpful into a conversation with somebody. It might be publicising in our notices or our website, or ways in which we can connect with God in worship throughout the whole of our lives. To talk about it and to share it. I was very struck when we were thinking of appointing a new youth worker, and we got a group of young people and older people together to think about what priorities there might be. And I was struck by one of our, she's a student now and away from our area, but she worships with us when she's at home and in a student kind of church when she's away. And I said, what's the difference between the worship? And I thought she would say, well, when I'm away at uni, the preaching is so much better and the worship is so much livelier. That's what I thought she would say. But she didn't. She said, actually, I get as much out of the worship and the preaching, whatever. But it's afterwards that people at the church where I'm a student, they talk about what's gone on in the service and how that applies to their lives. But when I'm back home, everybody just wants to go home. But is there a way that gently and naturally, as elders, we can foster the sense in our congregations that worship is for the whole of life? And there are these resources and patterns, centuries old, that are there for all of us to resource and encourage us to keep making these connections between worship and the whole of life. So, that's the first thing. Making connections, and I said that would be the longest, and it is. What I'd like to go on now is to think about nurturing a culture of expectancy. If worship is for the whole of life, 7 whole days, not 1 in 7, I will praise thee, as the poet George Herbert suggests, then we will need to do all we can to build a culture of expectancy around worship. That we're expecting to meet with God. I'm consistently inspired by the culture of expectancy in worship, which our first minister at Lenzie Union helped to build. A history of the congregation recalls, rarely did a service pass without his prayer. This man, Mr. Miller, without his prayer, we would see Jesus. And his face shone as he poured out his soul in supplication and thanksgiving, or pleaded like one inspired that his people might be reconciled to God. He preached Christ. He lived Christ. We would see Jesus. Now there's expectancy. There's something to pray as we wait for the service to begin, rather than saying, gosh, it's cold this morning. Where is everybody? We would see Jesus. There's something to pray as we unlock the door. Why am I doing that again? Or hand out the hymn book, or operate the screens and the sound. We would see Jesus. Meet with Jesus now, together, in our journey as disciples. Nurturing expectancy. There was a fashion for inscribing on pulpits these words from John's Gospel, the request of the Greeks who came to the feast in Jerusalem, we would see Jesus. Imagine if every elder in every congregation focused on praying these words, just 4 words, before every service of public worship. Expectancy that we will together meet Jesus as we come with the whole of our lives. So, where is our level of expectancy for public worship just now? When I went to Lenzie, the interim moderator said, Dan, it will really be much harder for you than it was for me. You see, your predecessor retired in his 60s when he was still fit and able. Mine was really elderly when he retired. And all I had to do was walk down the steps after the service without tripping over, and they said, "Lovely service." At what level are our expectations for worship? You sometimes hear the standard order of service called a hymn prayer sandwich. And whatever might be the positive or negative aspects of that order, the phrase doesn't exactly shine with expectancy, does it? "Oh, you must come along to our hymn prayer sandwich on Sunday. Why not bring a friend? It will be a real doorstopper." Yes, we might find public worship frustrating at times, predictable. But how is it that we can so easily take an opportunity for an encounter with the living God in worship and turn it into something as bland as a supermarket sandwich? A culture of expectancy. We can create a culture of expectancy with quite simple changes. The other night, I overheard my wife helping our daughter revise for the higher Spanish exam next week. What's sandwich in Spanish? Even I know that. Our Carmichael male always marches on his stomach. Spanish for sandwich is bocadillo. A hymn prayer bocadillo. Now that, with a change of word, sounds exciting. That sounds like holidays. That sounds like Spanish markets and beaches and sunshine. I'm expecting something now. With simple changes, we can raise a culture of expectancy. We would see Jesus. If every elder in every congregation, starting with us, prayed that before the start of every service of public worship, that by the Spirit, God will use this time of worship to draw us into an encounter with the living God through Jesus Christ. And what can we expect? When we pray, we would see Jesus. The minister of the church where I did my first student placement used Isaiah chapter 6 to explain the flow of worship, and it's always made sense to me. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. The whole earth is full of God's glory. We begin by praising God for who God is. We begin by expecting to be brought into the presence of the Holy One and praying for that. Then Isaiah goes on, "Woe is to me, I cried, I am ruined, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty." We admit our sins in the presence of the Holy God. We can expect honesty in worship. We can expect to be honest in worship. And it goes on. Then one of the seraphs flew to me with a live coal in his hand, which he had taken with tongs from the altar. With it he touched my mouth and said, "See, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away, your sin atoned for. We receive and accept the forgiveness of God in Jesus." We can expect the touch of God's love and peace and grace in worship. Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, "Whom shall I send, and who will go for us?" We hear God's word and gather around it as it's read and proclaimed. We can expect to hear God's challenge, God's comfort, God's presence in our worship. And I said, "Here am I, send me." We respond to God's call today in prayer and action. We can expect to be changed, to alter our plans. Culture of expectancy. We would see Jesus. Worship is transforming. When we've met with the living God in worship, we can say with Jacob at Bethel, "Surely the Lord is in this place. How awesome is this place! This is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven." Pause for a moment. I just invite you to think about expectancy in worship. What do you expect in worship? And is there something about expectancy that we can develop in our own worshipping communities? So, what do you expect in worship? And is there something we can be involved in to foster and encourage expectancy where we worship? So just a couple of minutes to think on that, and then that's that section finished. Thank you. We're thinking about worship, the whole of life in our journey of discipleship. We've thought about developing connections between worship and the whole of life, fostering, nurturing a culture of expectancy in our worship. And to finish with, I'd like to look at 3 areas in our journey of discipleship where it's important to weave worship into the whole of life and the whole of life into worship. And they're probably self-obvious, and none of these will come as surprises. But if as elders we are called to take a lead in this journey of discipleship, then these will be areas that we'll want to give attention to. How about that as an outfit for going to a church service? This is called a church coat, and it wasn't for clergy. It was just for people to wear going along to church. It's in the British Museum. It comes from Transylvania in Romania now, and it was made in the late 1800s or early 1900s, and it was worn by Lutherans on Sundays at church. And the idea was that when you wore the coat, you didn't drink alcohol, you didn't swear, or that sort of stuff. I saw it at an exhibition at the British Museum earlier in the year, and I thought, well, what did they do when they took the coat off? Did they just start drinking and swearing and doing the stuff they weren't supposed to do and think, whoa, thank goodness that's over? I'm sure they didn't. Worship or on Sundays or worship any day of the week is, I guess, only worth something if we allow it to affect our choice of language, our choice of attitudes. As elders, thinking about worship, making connections, culture of expectancy, are we not invited to take a lead? That we don't change when we go back home, however hard that is. And we're the same as we worship and for the whole of life. We know that already. It's just so hard to put into practice. But God promises us the help of the Spirit, and we're encouraged to be intentional about it. The second area is wider than just the individual. This is it's a painting, it's really more of a fresco, called The Resurrection. It was by a man called Piero della Francesca. It was painted in the 1460s, and it's in a place called the Palazzo Comunale in San Sepolcro in Italy. This is a famous painting of the resurrection of Jesus, rising from the tomb and carrying a victory flag while the guards sleep on. It's maybe not something you'd want on your wall at home, or even something that you'd want to take care of in your church building, but it has sometimes been called the most famous painting in the world, and a lot of effort was made by the Allied army in World War II to spare it from being damaged in the fighting in Italy. To me, it's actually the setting of the painting that's important for worship whole of life. It wasn't painted for a church building, but for a town hall. Not to be admired on a Sunday, but passed by Monday to Friday. Maybe it might just be my kind of romantic, wistful thinking, but I imagine town officials passing by that image on their way to make decisions on people's property and taxes and making laws. I imagine hard-pressed people looking for justice passing it by. And as each of them passed it, I imagine them, perhaps wistfully, being taken aback by this depiction on what happened on the first day of the week, that Sunday, Easter Sunday, and how death gave way to life, and fear gave way to peace, and despair gave way to hope. And maybe it's my wistful thinking, but I imagine officials having their minds changed by that painting, and realizing, well, if he's risen, then he must be in charge, and what he said matters, so I need to watch the way I make decisions. And I imagine lives changed for the better by that painting. Worship, an encounter with the living God on a Sunday or any day, is only worth something if lives are changed for the better. Easier to say than to put into practice. But we are promised the power of the Spirit. And as elders, are we invited to take a lead in this journey of this journey of discipleship, worship, whole of life, lives changed for the better? Then the last one. This is our last image. It seemed to me to speak of worship and life woven together. We spent a few hours on Iona, described as a thin place between earth and heaven during the Easter holidays. And this is, I think, MacLean's cross on the road from the ferry to the Abbey. And it was put there, so the little plaque on the bottom of it says, for pilgrims. And on one side, there's a depiction of the crucifixion. And the road in that picture seems to me to represent the journey of discipleship that we're all on, that folk in our congregations are on, in our communities. And the field, the whole of life, like that crofter giving thanks for the birth of the sheep, and representing the whole of our lives, whether it's around green places or built up or whatever. And the cross and the church there in the middle of it all, worship in the whole of life. Eugene Peterson of the Message translation fame has written that we go to church to worship, to pray and learn to pray. And that's what we can encourage each other to do as Christians and as elders We think it's complicated to weave worship into the whole of life. We don't know how to start, what strategy to adopt. And yet, perhaps, a first step, every step, is more straightforward than we think. Just say it to God. Worship for the whole of life. I'm going to end by reading from this book, which is called Say It to God. It's by a Benedictine monk called Luigi Gioia, and it was the Archbishop of Canterbury's Lent book for 2018. And here he describes worship in the whole of life, the things we find difficult and the excitements, and a very practical way for all of us, or to encourage folk in our congregations, just to say it to God. He begins by writing about how prayer, worship, first began to make sense to him. I'm 17. My faith has just come alive. I've discovered the Psalms and fallen in love with them, and have just read a wonderful book on prayer. So I try to enter the habit of praying daily, or having my daily quiet time, as some people nicely call it. And, well, it works. The 5 minutes a day I had decided to devote to prayer soon seem too short. They become 15, 20, 25 minutes. I add 5 more minutes every day and I'm not bored. I love it. It gives me so much peace, so much joy. These first lucky days, for a reason I do not remember, I had my home almost to myself, so I could enjoy all the silence and the peace I wanted. But this blessed time was not going to last. I have 3 siblings, younger than me. The little one was 2 or 3 at the time. Love them to pieces, but they could be so annoying. Bless them. So imagine the scene. I shut myself in my room. I sit in a chair. I read a psalm, reread it. A sentence strikes me. I close my eyes and try to repeat it gently with my heart. My siblings are playing hide and seek. One of them is unhappy about something. They start arguing. The little one starts crying and comes banging at my door. So frustrating. I still try to keep focused, but I'm increasingly angry. Exasperation mounts, and at one point I end up shouting at my siblings to shut up, not once but several times, until, discouraged and ridden with guilt, I lose my temper and give up. This scene occurs 2 or 3 times until at the end of that week I talk about the experience with a Benedictine monk. In the course of that conversation I receive an unforgettable lesson about prayer. As I vent to him my frustration and ask forgiveness for having got angry, he tells me a story of a Christian in Vietnam during the time of persecution. He was arrested because of his faith and spent several years in the tiniest cell, impossibly overcrowded, with robbers, murderers and other criminals. When decades later he was finally released, he said that prayer, deep prayer of the heart, had never left him in that prison, and that far from distracting him, noise, discomfort, shouting and every sort of misery he had suffered there had become the fuel of his prayer, not as an obstacle, but as the medium through which he learnt to pray. So this Benedictine monk ended up saying to me, the test of your prayer, that your prayer is authentic, is learning how to turn everything into prayer. Any scrap of wood is good for the fire. Worship, the whole of life, making connections, expectancy, our own life, bettering lives for others. Doesn't it begin in prayer? And just bringing any scrap of wood to God on a Sunday morning, on a Friday night, on a Wednesday lunchtime. Any scrap of wood, and say it to God the whole of my life, my family, those I love, what I love about them, what's annoying me about them. Say it to God. My church, what I love about it, the times I meet with God, what frustrates me, the times God seems so far away from what we're doing. The other are people in the place that really annoy me. Say it to God. Don't let the frustration or the noise drown it out. Our community, the places we're working, we're living, we're relaxing, we're meeting others, the things that are good, the things that the council just can't get right, the things they're trying to do. Say it to God. Don't let the noise drown it out. And the world, the whole of it, the places we've been to that have taken our breath away with beauty, the places we've been to that have taken our breath away because of the poverty and the injustice. Don't let the noise, the frustration, drown out your discipleship. Say it to God. Any scrap of wood will do. Worship. The whole of life. Connections. Expectancy. Opportunities. Saying it to God. So can I finish with a prayer? It's a Celtic prayer from a collection by a namesake, Alexander Carmichael. God to enfold me, God to surround me, God in my speaking, God in my thinking, God in my sleeping, God in my waking, God in my watching, God in my hoping, God in my life, God in my lips, God in my soul, God in my heart,